students. I am Miss Alexander, your social studies teacher. Welcome to lesson 10. In the previous lesson, we started discussing child abuse, and so we would like to continue in our discussion. Now, before we move on to that discussion, as always, we do a quick recap on what was done in the previous lesson. In the previous lesson, we understood that child abuse is when a parent or caregiver, whether through an initial harm or mistreatment, or failing to act, causes injury, death, emotional harm, or even risk of harm to a child under 18 years old. So here are some true or false questions. Neglect and medical abuse are two forms of abuse. Is that true or false? Neglect and medical abuse are two forms of abuse. Is that true or is it false? All right, if you said true, then you are correct. Let's move on to the other question. Child sexual abuse is any sexual activity with a child, such as fondling, oral genital contact, intercourse, exploitation, or exposure to child pornography. Is this statement true or is it false? So listen again. Sexual child abuse is any sexual activity with a child, such as fondling, oral genital contact, intercourse, exploitation, or exposure to child pornography. Is that statement true or is it false? All right. If you said true, you are correct. Good job. Let's move on to the third question. When dealing with traumatized children, actively listening to the child is not necessary. When dealing with traumatized children, actively listening is not necessary. Is that statement true or is it false? All right, the statement is false. So if you said false, good job to you. I'm happy that you remembered some of the key takeaway points from lesson 9. Let's move right into today's lesson. The objectives for today, what are they? At the end of today's session, students must be able to 1. Identify abusive situations. 2. State conditions which are necessary for promoting security and love. 3. Make suggestions and recommendations for reducing the practice of child abuse. And 4. Be tolerant with children who need attention and affection. So let's move into the first aspect, identifying abusive situations. Now, a child who's being abused may feel guilty, ashamed, or even confused. He or she may be afraid to tell someone about the abuse, especially if the abuser is a parent, a relative, or a family friend. That's why it's important to identify abusive situations. To identify abusive situations mean that you are able to recognize the signs or symptoms of abuse either on a child or recognize behaviors that lead one to conclude that, a child is being abused. We must also keep in mind that there are specific signs and symptoms depending on the type of abuse that is committed. Now, in the previous lesson, we understood that there are different forms of child abuse, and so in the same way there are different forms, the signs and symptoms also vary. It is important to also note that the presence of warning signs or these signs and symptoms, as we mentioned, does not necessarily mean that a child is being abused. And so that's very important for us to keep in mind. So let's do this quick activity. Can you identify any abusive situation? Perhaps you might have seen something happened before, whether it was at school, in your community, while traveling somewhere. Perhaps it might have even been on a television program or while looking at a program online. Can you identify any abusive situation? Think about it. And you can make a jotting of it. So I'm going to give you just about 5 seconds to do that. Think, do a quick flashback, and see what you recall, or just stretch your imagination and think of what may be an abusive situation based on what we would have discussed thus far. All right, so you're going to compare your responses with what we're about to discuss. Here are some general situations to consider. Withdrawal from friends or usual activity. Sometimes abused children would tend to be very withdrawn. They are withdrawn from their friends, they're withdrawn from their peers, or they're withdrawn from the activities that they usually do, whether it's playing football, whether it's playing cricket, whether it's hanging out a lot with their friends, and so on. So that is at least one sign to pick up. The second one is changes in behavior, such as aggression, anger, hostility, or hyperactivity, or changes in school performance. Another sign is depression, anxiety, or unusual fears or a sudden loss of self-confidence. So perhaps you may know of a child who is usually happy. They're always in good spirits, and then there has just drastically been a change in their behavior. Another sign is an apparent lack of supervision. Some children have little to no supervision, and that's because of the absenteeism of a parent or the caregiver. There's also frequent absences from school. Another sign is reluctance to leave school activities as if he or she does not want to go home. And this is a major sign to pick up on, because sometimes children prefer to stay out of their homes, out of the abusive situations, rather than, being there, being present, and experiencing the same situation over and over again, or increasing their possibility of experiencing that abusive situation when they're at home. Another sign is attempts at running away. Another sign that a child is being abused is being rebellious or having defiant behavior. That means that they're usually sometimes categorized as troublesome at school, and so they do not listen and follow the rules or the guidelines that are usually given to them. Another sign is also self-harm or attempts at suicide. These are just a few signs and symptoms of child abuse. Like I said when we started off, there are different signs and symptoms of child abuse based on the form of child abuse. So one of your takeaway activity is to research on signs and symptoms of specific forms of child abuse. So whether you choose sexual abuse, you can check for signs and symptoms of that. Whether you want to select emotional abuse, you can also check for signs and symptoms on emotional abuse. So that's your takeaway activity for today. Now let's move on to the other subheading: conditions necessary for promoting security and love. Establishing social and emotional security, in particular when interacting with the child, is important. Social and emotional safety is the cornerstone of positive outcomes from abused children, since they are more likely to feel unsafe. So because abused children they're mostly concerned about their safety and their general well being. Many times they would respond in a way that is not necessarily so welcoming. Sometimes they may be withdrawn, like we started off by mentioning just now, one of the signs and symptoms of abuse. So it's very important that adults, even their peers, show signs that there would create a sense of security and love when the child is around. So let's move into another activity. Can you identify conditions that promote security and love for a child? Think about it. We would have mentioned in the previous lesson what child abuse is. We identified the various forms, and then we also went into discussing just a few minutes ago the signs and symptoms. And so we have a general understanding of what it is exactly children feel and what they do not experience that contribute to their entire health and well being. So, can you identify conditions that promote security and love for a child? Take a few minutes, or rather seconds, and you can jot them down in your book. Now, one of the things that I want to encourage you to do is that even when we would have completed this lesson, you can always return to the activity and jot down any response that came to mind that you were unable to do in the time period in which I gave you. And you think it's an excellent response to the activity question. All right, so you should be finished now. So let's move right on. Here are some tips for parents and caregivers to ensure that they promote security and love. They should, 1, tell the child how much they love them. They can also look for opportunities to tell the child that they're proud of them. Another tip is smiling and making eye contact when talking with the child. Another one is showing physical affection whenever they can, such as hugging or tapping them on their shoulder or patting them. Another tip is looking for opportunities to praise or encourage the child. Now, it's important to note, like we would have mentioned, that at times abused children can have a very low self-esteem. And some of them also practice very poor self-care tips or self-care practices. And so it's very good to praise the child whenever they do something that's different and show that perhaps they're using courage or determination or perseverance. And so you praise them. Or perhaps too, the child would have done something good to take care of themselves. And so the parent or the caregiver can also praise the child in situations like those. Another tip is to create opportunities for special one-on-one time doing things they both enjoy doing. So whether the child and caregiver likes to perhaps paint or take a walk, or they like baking bread or cookies or making something, or even farming in the family farm or in the kitchen garden. Doing things that you have in common shows that you care and that you really want to spend time with that child. So now let's move into another heading: recommendations or suggestions for reducing the practice of abuse. Reducing the practice of child abuse requires a personal commitment, and we would have mentioned that before. An individual challenged with the likelihood of abusing children should also seek professional help and assistance. They may also need community support from friends, family members, and colleagues as they interact with children. Another recommendation is never discipline the child when you're angry or when you're out of control. Another tip is to take time out. If an individual recognizes that they're going to act out of frustration or other emotions physically, then they should find someone to talk to, or they should find someone to watch the child while they go on a walk, while they take a breather and they just take a time out from the entire situation. and they're able to bring themselves back together and then respond in a more positive way towards the child. Another recommendation is participate in the child's activities and get to know the child's friends. Another recommendation is never leave the child unattended, especially in a vehicle. Another suggestion that can be used is ask questions. Communicate with a child. For example, when a child says he or she does not want to be with someone, that may be a sign. So it's good to ask, why don't you want to be with that person? It's good to inquire and ask questions. Another tip is to listen to the child and believe what they say. A caregiver, a parent, or a teacher, whomever it is that deals with children, can also be aware of changes in the child's behavior or attitude and inquire into it. Like we would have mentioned, sometimes children move from being very happy and interactive to being aggressive or being withdrawn. And so it's very good to ask, why has there been a change in behavior? Another recommendation is to teach the child the correct names of their body parts. This is very important. So we know that, for example, there is a chart of the human body, and so it's good to acquaint children with the correct names and terms for their body parts. Another recommendation is to be alert for any talk that reveals premature sexual understanding. Another point is to make the interaction space, for example, home or classroom, a violence-free zone. Monitor the shows or programs that children look at, whether it's on television or online. Additionally, as much as possible, do not leave the child in the company of an abusive adult. So let's wrap up today's session and relook at some of the key points that we learned today. 1. To identify abusive situations means that you are able to recognize the signs or symptoms of abuse, either on a child, or recognize behaviors that leads one to conclude that a child is being abused. 2. The specific signs and symptoms depend on the type of abuse and it can vary. 3. The presence of warning signs does not necessarily mean that a child is being abused. 4. Social and emotional safety is the cornerstone of positive outcomes from abused children, since they are more likely to feel unsafe. Our 5th point is that reducing the practice of child abuse requires a personal commitment. An individual challenged with the likelihood of abusing children should seek professional help or seek the support of families, friends, or their colleagues. The 6th point is that some recommendations to parents and caregivers to prevent the practice of child abuse include: A. Never discipline a child when your anger is out of control. B. Teach your child the correct names of his or her body parts. And C. Make the interaction space, for example at home or within the classroom, a violence-free zone. Well, students, this has brought us to the end of our lesson. I am very happy to go through these 2 lessons with you in understanding child abuse and understanding that every child has a right to health and well-being. Abuse does not in any way lead to a positive health and well-being of a child. I trust that you learned quite a lot from these 2 lessons, or even today's lesson if you joined us for the first time. I am Miss Alexander saying bye for now and see you in the next lesson.